Lights, sirens, gunshots, trails of blood, families left devastated. As the news cameras roll in to document what has happened, they find devastation in the most ordinary of venues, the post office. And then when they start interviewing the postal workers, they all start saying the same thing. It could have been anyone. Someone went a step further, stating, "I understand why he did it." You might have seen the jokes and the video games, but there was a time when being a postal worker in the United States was perceived as being one of the most dangerous jobs in the country, where any moment a disgruntled colleague could come charging in, killing all in their wake. What government investigators would go on to find was that these incidents were taking place all over the US in post offices everywhere. They would peel back a network of sheer cruelty and sadism, of bureaucracy manipulation and massive power imbalances, all typified by shocking and unnecessary losses of life. And the scariest part is over half a century later, and nothing's changed. Today, we got the real story of going postal. Alright, so what actually is going postal? We've seen the video games, the headlines, and the tragedy that comes with adding such a phrase to common English parlance, but to understand it in context, we need to talk about how it all started. Massacres committed by postal workers and former postal workers. They're seemingly normal people with everyday societal jobs, but whose circumstances led to their mental unraveling with disastrously violent results. Nowadays, the phrase is used as a sort of catch-all for being apocalyptically angry, but it had very real origins. But it wasn't mere anger. The going postal era was characterized by extreme violence, revenge, and mercilessness. The first instance that we could find of a US postal worker going postal, for lack of a better term, was in the early 70s. But the phrase wouldn't gather true momentum until the 1980s and 90s, when there were a handful of high-profile killings in a short time. The phrase exists for a reason. So there are a lot of examples, and we couldn't possibly get to all of them. So we're going to lay out some of the darkest examples, but do know that there are plenty more out there. And if you're wondering why that is, well, hold that thought. We'll definitely be coming back to it later. Now, the most infamous postal worker massacre, that was in 1986. Up until then, there'd been a handful of other incidents where one or two people would be shot by a disgruntled USPS worker. But in Edmond, Oklahoma, events unfolded in a much darker way. On August the 20th, 1986, a relief carrier by the name of Patrick Sherrill arrived at his workplace, the Edmonton Post Office. It was 7 a.m. He had been disciplined the day before by management. He concealed 3 semi-automatic pistols in a mail carrier's bag alongside extra ammunition. He locked the doors behind him after he entered. There were 100 people inside. He shot and killed 14 people, including one of his supervisors. Another 6 were wounded as he attempted to hunt down his co-workers. Sherrill took his own life after police entered the facility. It was one of the deadliest mass shootings in the US at the time. It is still regarded as the largest workplace massacre in American history, and it's widely regarded as the event that kicked off the going postal era. Or take August of 1989, when 52-year-old postman John Merlin Taylor murdered his wife and then drove to the Orange Glen Post Office in Escondido, California, where he shot and killed 2 co-workers, and then himself. In Michigan, 1991, a little town called Royal Oak got the postal treatment when Thomas McIlvaine shot and killed 5 people, including himself, after he was fired for insubordination and fighting on his delivery route. And then there's May the 6th, 1993, when there were not 1, but 2 postal shootings on the same day on opposite sides of the country. Larry Jason in the post office of Dearborn, Michigan, shot 3 co-workers, which killed one of them before he took his own life. Hours later, in Dana Point, California, a man named Mark Richard Hilburn returned to the post office from which had recently been fired, killed 1 employee and injured another. Or maybe you prefer 1995, the City of Industry, California. Bruce Clark, a postal clerk, punched his boss in the back of the head before returning 10 minutes later and executing him with a revolver in front of 75 people. And it goes on. And on, and on. A long list of tragedy, trauma, and death that you can draw on a map of the United States. It was December of 1993 when the Florida newspaper, the St. Petersburg Times, printed the term going postal for the first time, writing, "The symposium was sponsored by the US Postal Service, which has seen so many outbursts that in some circles excessive stress is known as going postal. 35 people have been killed in 11 post office shootings since 1983. And this represents such a strange series of events for people who happen upon this phenomenon. The postal worker, the people that deliver your mail and are stereotypically cheerful and friendly. Many have a genuine joy and enthusiasm for delivering the mail. It gives them a sense of purpose, accomplishment, service, connectivity, and community. They are the goofballs you see affable videos of on Ring doorbell cameras the world over. So then, what is this deeply violent, cruel, vindictive underbelly we're seeing? Postal workers aren't just homicidal maniacs by nature. So what's being ignored here? What is the large Amazon package-size elephant in the room that has led to decades of unrelenting violent outbursts? Well, I can tell you, it's abuse. And now, another quick history lesson. The United States Postal Service has been around for a really long time. The US Post Office is so old that Benjamin Franklin was its first postmaster. Yes, really, in 1775. But thankfully, we don't need to go back that far, only to the establishment of the United States Postal Service, or USPS, in the early 70s. It had just become a shiny new federal agency courtesy of one President Richard Nixon. It was brought about by the passage of the Postal Reorganization Act, and one of this law's key requirements was for it to be financially self-sufficient. But running a nationwide postal service at a profit is not easy, and Congress knew this, so they employed a government subsidy system. The USPS would get an annual sum of money from the government to help get things up and running as part of their budget, but this would steadily decrease every year until the last payment came in 1982. From here on out, USPS was on its own. The training wheels had come off. So, in order to run a postal service the size of the United States, the logistical operation is genuinely enormous. So to be financially self-sufficient, things had to be really efficient. Work had to be done fast, and there were often pretty stringent targets to meet financially. All price increases needed to be approved by the Postal Regulatory Commission, and a unionized workforce meant that mass layoffs to save money just weren't practical. So what else could the Postal Service actually do in order to save money? Well, those running the service believed that the only thing that they could do was to squeeze existing workers as much as possible. And here is where we need to talk about making up the numbers, as it would become known in post offices countrywide. USPS supervisors are not given budgets in terms of dollars, but in terms of work hours. The more hours carriers say they'll need to finish their routes, the harder it gets for supervisors to meet their work hour budgets, which will get them in trouble with their own bosses. So supervisors were required to keep their post offices running efficiently by the government bigwigs above them, but this created a fundamental conflict within post offices across America. Regular postal workers would tell their supervisors how long it would take to deliver the day's packages on their routes, but this would cause division if workers thought it would take them longer than the managers did based on their data. And overtime was expensive. The best illustration of the different worldviews workers and management had when it came to making up the numbers came in an anecdote about a San Francisco post office. The workers there filed a class action grievance against their station manager for widespread harassment. The General Accounting Office, or GAO, would later report that managers used harassment to push carriers to meet productivity goals. But management said they were just trying to promote operational efficiency, which is the most corporate thing I've ever heard. And soon, power imbalances would develop into patterns of abuse. In sorting facilities, workers reported supervisors timing their bathroom breaks with stopwatches, looming over them so the workers can feel their presence while they worked, or filing official warnings if they were too slow on a machine by a matter of seconds. Is it going to be going Amazon next? Allegedly. Just a joke. This kind of micromanagement led to all kinds of problems for mail carriers and sorters alike. The post office was being run like a dictatorship. There was a clear command structure of supervisors at the top and postal workers below them, forming an antagonistic us versus them relationship that was structurally embedded into the USPS. And management itself did no favors in that dynamic. One manager described the environment like a pressure cooker. Managers were squeezed or reprimanded by the bosses above them as well. There was no time for polite conversation or human relations skills in many managers' eyes. Now, not all post office managers were like this. This is a symptom of the structure and culture through which the USPS operates. People working as supervisors and middle managers can be good bosses in the system who treat their subordinates fairly. However, this is very much an exception, as it required them to directly go against those above them, and when those people have the keys to your fucking job, it's just not that likely to happen, is it? As a result, many managers and supervisors would, as a policy, punish workers with warnings, write-ups, and suspensions for small infractions without confronting them first or giving them an informal opportunity to improve their work. But each post office also interpreted the rules differently, And what could get you a verbal warning in one town might get you suspended in another. Reviewing 145 discipline cases between 1985 and 1988, as well as interviewing 128 supervisors, the GAO found managers could and would punish the same acts completely differently. When postal workers would complain to their unions about such practices, supervisors retaliated against them by straight up ignoring labor laws and contract provisions meant to protect workers from abusive management practices. They would obstruct union stewards from making legitimate union requests and would stifle the long grievances process by any means necessary. What this effectively meant is that despite rules and labor laws designed to avoid this kind of scenario, the sheer size, scope, and bureaucracy of the postal service meant that managers could do what they wanted, all the while postal workers suffered what they had to. They had no real recourse that they could take. And what's worse is that according to investigators, in 1994, there was no criteria to identify bad managers who should be disciplined or fired. Union representatives widely reported that supervisors were not held accountable for harassing employees or purposefully violating the labor contract. I mean, it's one thing for managers to feel the pressure from above, the workforce stress, the understaffing, the tight budgets, and never enough time to fix it all. These are systemic issues that would render any workplace environment pretty damn toxic, but there remains managers who would simply bully those working below them because they knew how to game the system and recognized their untouchable position. They did it just because they could, just to be cruel. And it is within this workplace culture of rigidity, humiliation, and cruelty that going postal truly began. It's no coincidence that it is after the government subsidies ran out in 1982 that the same decade would be marred with some of the worst workplace killings in American history. One notorious incident between labor and management was when a female postal carrier who was 6 weeks pregnant fell down on cement during her work, which resulted in her losing her unborn child. Did management gather around her and try to look after their co-worker going through this unimaginable trauma? Well, no. They didn't. She received an official letter of warning. It was apparently not the only time a worker accidentally injured themselves on the job only to receive a formal reprimand. The post office just happened to be called Royal Oak, the very one in Michigan where Thomas McIlvaine would go on to kill his co-workers before turning the gun on himself. The management at Royal Oak were experienced bullies and likely picked on McIlvaine because he was an easy target who, to put it kindly, had some anger management issues. Even McIlvaine himself would have told you that he had short fuse, that he struggled to keep a lid on, and this was backed up by his less than stellar military record. McIlvaine had several strange incidents that mark his record, like driving a tank over a car without authorization after arguing with some officers, leading to his general discharge from the Marines. There are many reasons not to do this that I don't need to explain to you. McIlvaine didn't seem to take kindly to authority, and the post office had a similar disciplinarian structure to the military. He had a temper, and he was mentally unstable. This was a match made in hell. He had a fraught relationship with management, which mainly involved the managers picking on this former Marine and professional kickboxer. Not a super smart move, and McIlvaine responding with crude and abusive language. On one occasion, 3 supervisors insisted the brake lights on McIlvaine's delivery truck weren't working properly and made him go to maintenance to get them fixed. When he got there, the vehicle technician told him that the brake lights were working just fine, just as McIlvaine asserted. They were wasting his time and making him look like a fool for no other reason than to be unkind. McIlvaine is repeatedly accused in his files of thinking management was out to get him. And he was kind of right. Eventually, he was fired for fighting on his route, as was mentioned previously. After the termination process began, because this is USPS and everything needs a process, McIlvaine reportedly threatened to kill his managers 21 separate times. In the end, they just pushed the wrong guy too far. After the Edmonton shooting in which Patrick Sherrill killed 14 people, the National Association of Letter Carriers president Vincent Sombroto gave a statement that nobody expected to hear. It wasn't thoughts or prayers, and we'll quote him here. While we are shocked and dismayed by what happened and offer our prayers to those surviving victims now in the hospital, we cannot help but believe that Mr. Sherrill was pushed over the brink by irresponsible and coercive management policies by the Postal Service in the Oklahoma City region. So why didn't these people just quit their jobs? Unfortunately, it's just not that simple for many people, is it? The USPS is all a lot of workers have ever known in terms of their careers. If that's all you have experience in, it could be really hard to go and start from the bottom again. You see, the post office has a unique quirk about it. It's one of the very few career progressions where people without a college education can eventually make middle-class money. People have families to support, they have debts to pay. Starting a career over again just didn't make sense, especially when many postal workers are middle-aged or older. So people ended up stuck in a well-paying job with good benefits, but one that they hated because they were trapped in a job that they felt they couldn't leave. Throw in that special workplace culture on top, and in many cases, when they were eventually fired, a select few decided that they had nothing left to lose. And voila, going postal. And between the bureaucracy, the rigidity of the command structure, the lack of flexibility, the overworking, the dehumanization, the lack of autonomy, the corporate culture, the bullying, the harassment, the lack of mental health programs, the chronic stress, the isolation, and the powerlessness of the average worker to change any of it, all we can really say is anyone surprised what it all led to? Alright, so what's being done about the going postal phenomenon? Have things changed since the gory days of the 80s and 90s? Well, like most things in life, it's complicated, it's potentially controversial. It was a government response. In 1998, the United States Congress conducted a joint hearing to review the violence in the U.S. Postal Service. In it, they concluded that while the Postal Service accounted for less than 1% of the full-time civilian labor force, 13% of workplace homicides were committed at postal facilities by current or former employees. But these numbers are actually a little overstated. Postal events are pretty episodic, and they happen in clusters over time, meaning that those numbers, by 1998 standards, may have been true, but it was also true that the workplace homicide rate across the decades in the US was over 3 times higher in retail. So, is going postal just an overstated phenomenon? After all, there isn't a going retail. I mean, perhaps there should be. And it's probably important to mention here that not every postal worker has tried to shoot up their workplace. The vast majority of postal workers dealt with the issues and the stress that the job posed without them turning homicidal. It is a hard job with not a lot of appreciation, but you can't absolve the perpetrators of what they did when so many others didn't turn to the same deadly solution to their problems. The post office at its peak had almost 800,000 workers, and by comparison to that, the number of going postal instances in total makes the post office actually look like a pretty safe place to work in total terms. However, nobody could deny the clear and present dangers within the way the USPS operated. The widespread abuse and everything that came with it was structural. The numbers don't lie, but the bodies definitely don't. In the meantime, a series of investigations into the post office's workplace uncovered a culture that not only contributed to those shootings, but many viewed as the main culprit. There were more than a dozen General Accounting Office reports on labor management relations at the post office. The findings of these government investigations were appalling. They found the Postal Service fostered a broken and dangerous relationship between bosses and workers at best. But, more often than not, it was simply an avenue for managers to dole out unwanted cruelty on those below them in the hierarchy. Everyone knew what the problem was. It was the numbers. Strategies that did work on a small scale to fix the relationship between labor and management inevitably got lost in the massive bureaucracy machine. The whole system was just broken. And for the most part, everyday Americans simply didn't care. People shied away from the death on their doorsteps every morning. And when it was addressed, going postal just turned into a sensationalized punchline. Similarly, the USPS itself tried to change, like implementing a zero-tolerance system for abuse after events like Royal Oak. But when the abuse is endemic to the structure, policies are just words. At the end of the day, the mail just needs to be delivered on time. And so you might be surprised to learn that not much has changed, even today, with how the USPS operates. The going postal incidents are largely down since the mid-2000s. But why? I mean, if nothing's changed, why is it less violent? Well, the USPS today is smaller than it was at its peak, with a little over 500,000 people being employed as part of its service, as opposed to the nearly 800,000 at the height in the late 80s. It might stand to reason that the USPS itself, being smaller, also has reduced the instances of going postal by sheer numbers and probability alone. And again, these violent outbursts are somewhat episodic. Culturally, shooting up one's workplace has become less common than it was in the 80s and 90s, and seeing fewer instances of it happening reduces the chance that a disgruntled worker could copy someone else. One of these things has to have made a difference, because in reality, it isn't the culture that's changed, nor is the way the USPS operates. Aaron Gordon, who wrote a great piece on going postal for Vice, put the current attitude of postal workers best, and we'll quote him here. Many postal workers still wish that the USPS was a better and more humane place to work. Most of all, they wish the USPS was a place where being a good boss or being a good worker actually mattered. The word authoritarian is used a lot to describe USPS management and even its leadership, and that kind of culture is hard to change. As early as 1981, Postmaster General William Bolger tried to curb the USPS's management philosophy away from the traditional authoritarian style of management and towards increasing worker involvement to finding solutions to the problems they faced before going postal was even a thing. But a decade of that kind of management had already set in deep. Now we're at over half a century. The going philosophy among USPS management, according to outgoing Postmaster General Anthony Frank in 1992, was, quoting him here, "I ate dirt for 20 years. Now it's your turn to eat dirt." And postal workers from around the US who have been part of the system for a long time agreed that the basic characterization of the post office in the mid-90s is still accurate today. It is an authoritarian, top-down organization in which policy is set by higher-ups who often have never done the work of sorting and delivering mail. Nobody has any real say on how the work is done, and there is a widespread perception that supervisors and managers are still not selected on merit. The us versus them culture is still there, as is the abuse. One 27-year-old mail handler at a processing and distribution facility in Oklahoma wrote, quote, "I cannot even begin to tell you how incredulous I was reading this, to know that my same daily complaints and laments were a problem back nearly as far as when I was born, and that they haven't been resolved in the slightest. It's so disheartening to me." So, has it really got better? Well, in a way, sort of. There are fewer incidents now, fewer people are being shot by their colleagues and dying prematurely, and that is important. The numbers also do indicate a general trend of improvement, largely in spite of the USPS rather than because of it. In 2000, there were 10,553 equal employment opportunity complaints filed against the USPS by employees out of a workforce of 786,516, or a rate of 1.34%. By 2018, the latest year for which these statistics are available, that was just 4,081 complaints out of 633,641 workers, or a rate of 0.64%, less than half of what it was in 2000. But again, this cannot be put down to working conditions within the USPS. It could also be affected by an apathy of over half a century of neglect that makes people think that it's just not worth their time to fill out the form. Rural postal workers actually have a completely different system where they can take as long as they want to deliver the mail. They have no need to make up the numbers because in the most rural zones, it's all about just having access at all. But these postal workers don't suffer any of the huge issues that making up the numbers requires in more urban zones. It seems that the solution here is simple. If all postal workers worked on this model, they would have more control and autonomy over their work. But crucially for the USPS, this approach would seemingly harm its financial self-sufficiency. Even if hiring more workers and setting higher prices was done by the UPS, the leadership of the department doesn't seem interested in making changes that would benefit the workforce in the long term. There are also indications that might show that things are getting worse again when it comes to the USPS and going postal, despite a gap of around 10 years after 2006, where shootings and going postal instances declined significantly. There have been 3 in 2017, 2021, and 2022. It's likely that more have gone unreported outside of local news circles, and it seems like the public perception has yet to really change either in response. And so the problems are still present. Workers are being stretched to breaking point. Post officers are having to do more and more with less and less. The culture of abuse continues, and we may be starting to see a small flare-up of workers going postal again. Even after the shootings, USPS upper management were dismissing the problem as statistically insignificant or passing blame onto mentally disturbed military veterans with PTSD, excuses experts later dismissed. But regardless of the reasons, these are still human beings who struggled with poor working conditions and abuse. One of the darkest things about the going postal phenomenon is the understanding that the shootings largely changed nothing in the grand scheme of things. All that bloodshed and death reduced to a mere joke in video games. Thank you for watching.